One of my favorite things in the world to do is watch Friends. I know it's been off for years and years. It's not even around, but I still find myself binge watching old episodes. And I was thinking about this today and thinking, it's the predictability of the friends in the circle, right? You have Chandler with his quirkiness, Monica with her type A of just everything has to be so neat and tidy and organized. It's Phoebe's ability to make you laugh at her silly songs. Ross always comes in with those smart comments, and Joey and him and his food, like it is just so hilarious. And of course, Rachel, she just brings everybody together, and it's just such this beautiful, cohesive team of people. And it's why I wanted to come on and share with you today that I have an opportunity for you to find your friends in the content creation space. So if you are thinking about creating your first or your next digital course, I don't want you to miss this opportunity because Amy Porterfield just opened the doors for registration for her Course Confident Bootcamp. And I'm actually offering a special bonus for anyone that registers for the Course Confident Bootcamp through my special link. So I want you to go to krystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register. That's krystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And what you're going to find when you get there is I have this special bonus private podcast series. It's called Money Mindset for Creators. So I want you to go register for Amy's bootcamp, download the podcast, and immediately start listening to it, because what this training is set up to do is to help you get your mind right about monetizing your content, making money so that you can fuel your content creation dreams. So go to krystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register for Course Confident. And I cannot wait for you to find your friends and find the people that will be there for you. Do you see what I did there? Yeah, nice little friends segue connection. Go to krystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And I cannot wait to see you inside. Okay, let's get into today's episode. I've said this a few times on the podcast before, but today's guest really deserves for me to say it again and again and again, because one of the things I love so much about being a content creator is the ability for all of us to contribute to this industry in our own unique way. Because on the surface, if you were to look at myself and today's guest, you would say, Krystal, aren't y'all competitors? Don't y'all do the same thing? And the truth is, no, we don't. We have our own love affair with podcasting and creating content and helping others succeed, which is why I wanted to have Anne on the show today. So today's episode, our interview is with Anne Claessen, the founder of the Podcast Babes, which the Podcast Babes helps podcasters monetize their podcast before they have thousands of downloads. Yeah, your ears just perked up. You're like, wait, oh, that's me. Because I know that's a big majority of this audience. We have a few people that have really big shows, but the majority of the people listening to this podcast, you don't get 1,000 downloads every single time you put out a brand new episode. And that is okay. All right. Because Anne is here today to share so many tips and tricks that you probably would never hear from me, because again, we bring our own unique spin to this industry and what we do with content creation. But she really helps people through offering masterminds and online courses and done-for-you podcast production with the Podcast Babes. And you're just going to love this conversation today. So let's get right to it. Welcome to the Profit Podcast, where we teach you how to start, launch, and market your content with confidence. I'm your host, Krystal Profit, and I'm so excited that you're here. Thanks for hanging out with me today, because if you've been trying to figure out the world of content creation, this is the show that will help be your time-saving shortcut. So let's get right to it, shall we? All right, Profit Podcast listeners, I'm so excited for today's guest. Welcome to the show, Anne. I'm so happy that you're here.
Yay! Thank you, Krystal. I'm super excited for this interview today.
Oh my gosh. I mean, it's always so much fun whenever I talk to someone who is equally obsessed with podcasting or content creation. And, you had me on your show, you have the podcast babes, and we just had such a fantastic conversation. So I'm happy that you are here today.
Yeah, I love that we can continue the conversation. We can chat even more about our favorite topic.
Yeah. And I think that it's great because I want everybody listening to this, because I often get this question when someone says, well, this one person wants to be on my show, but they do something similar to what I do. Like they're, what we would call the quote competition. So I just don't know that this is right. And I don't see it that way in the podcasting industry. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I feel like there are so many aspects to podcasting. And you have a different specialty than me. So what we do in the interview then is to focus on how we are different. Because I think that is how we can complement each other and how we can teach each other's audiences even more about this topic. Like podcasting is so broad, and then you go even broader with content creation. So there are so many different things to talk about, and everyone has their own experiences. So I always just try to pick a topic that is different from what we talked about before, that your experience is different than my experience and how that's different. And then you're never really competing with each other, I think. I think it's only complementing each other and making it even more awesome.
Yes, that's so well said. And thank you. Yeah, I totally agree with that. But I want to get into your podcast journey. So how did you become the Podcast Babes founder? How did you get into podcasting? What did that look like?
Yeah, I have a weird story. I was traveling after I went to university, got all my degrees, and I actually ended all that with a massive burnout. It was no fun. I had a massive burnout and I was like, I don't know what to do with my life. I also decided that I didn't want to go into the profession that I was actually planning to. I was going to be a lawyer. So I went to school for that, went to law school, have my master's and everything. And then I was like, you know what? I don't think this is for me. So I was in this place of confusion. Like I didn't know what to do. I was burnt out and I was like, okay, I'll just go travel and, as we millennials do, find myself in Southeast Asia. Which is kind of what happened to be honest. Like that just taking that step back and thinking about, okay, what do I actually want to do? That led me towards podcasting eventually. I always thought like, oh, one day I want to be a digital nomad. I want to work online, have my own business, but one day in the far, far future. And when I was traveling, I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna give it a shot. And I still didn't know what I wanted to do. So I just figured it out while also taking action. So that meant for me that I took a course to become a virtual assistant. Which is really broad. You can do so many things as a virtual assistant, like so many tasks. So I was like, this is great. I can try out a bunch of different things and I can see what I like and what I don't like. One of the modules was podcast management. And I just fell in love. I was always listening to podcasts before that. So this whole new world opened in front of me when I discovered that there's actually people working on these podcasts. It's not just someone recording it and then I listen to it. Like there's this in-between phase where they edit the show and write show notes and like all these things that people are working on behind the scenes. And I was like, cool. I want to do this. This is for me. So that's how I started. So I didn't start with my own podcast as many people start with, but I actually started working for clients immediately as a freelancer. And then after a while, had some good experiences with clients, had some bad experiences as a new freelancer. That is unfortunately also part of it, but maybe it's also good because I learned so much from that time. So I did that for about a year. And after a year, I realized that I am not the perfect freelancer. I'm actually good at some parts of podcast management, but then other parts I'm not necessarily great at. And there are other people who are actually great at that part. So I decided to switch around my whole business model. I also learned so much from working with different clients that I was like, I also want a way to share this with other podcasters, because now I had this like cool behind the scenes from so many clients. And I also started my own podcast in the meantime, and I just wanted to share that. So I started the Podcast Babes, or kind of like renamed my freelance business into the Podcast Babes, and eventually turned that into the agency that it is today. So that means that I have a small team of female editors, copywriters, and VAs, social media manager, who help me to run our clients' show. And I have the opportunity to also be a little bit more strategic and share more about what I learned in these years, almost 3 years now in podcasting.
That's so awesome. Oh my God. I have like 7 follow-up questions to everything because I love hearing people's stories. And I think it's so great whenever, you have, like we were just talking about earlier, is you have this totally different experience than I do. And I think that it's one of the reasons why I love podcasting so much, because, we could have sat and talked forever about, something else, but maybe this particular part of your story might not have come up had you not been on this show today to talk about what we're talking about today. So it's just another reason why I love it so much. But my first follow-up question is, how long were you doing like podcast production for other people before you said, I could do this? Like I could sound better than my client, or, maybe my message would be stronger. Like, tell me a little bit about that process.
Well, it was quite difficult to get started because I felt like I do this for a living. Like, I am the quote unquote expert. So I need to do this right. So it felt like there was this huge barrier into starting my own podcast because I felt like it had to be perfect. So what I did, actually, I started my own podcast completely separate from my work as a podcast manager. So it was really a passion project. I just wanted to interview my friends because I was still traveling, and I was like, I just want to know how it is. And I don't know, I just wanted to have my own thing as well, instead of just working for clients. So that's how it started. But I made all the mistakes that new podcasters make, like literally all the rookie mistakes, which is also good, I think, because now I can understand my clients so much better. So what I did is, after 7 episodes, which I think is exactly the average, I had podfade. So that means that life got busy, I got busy with client work, and I skipped a release date and another one and another one, and then 6 months later I was like, oh yeah, I had a podcast. Which happens a lot, and that literally happened to me. So yeah, eventually I got back to the podcast and started it up again. I rebranded it and everything, and it's now called Digital Nomad Stories. And I have been consistently releasing weekly episodes for, I think it's like 65 weeks now, so over a year. So yeah, got back to it, and yeah, it was an experience. But then later I also started the Podcast Babes podcast, and that was when I felt like it needed to be perfect. And when I did the whole rebranding into the Podcast Babes, I was like, this is actually the perfect time. So let's just do it. And it was not perfect. Like my first episodes, I think your first episode, you always feel like it's super cringy. But I was like, okay, if I don't do this now, there will never be a perfect time. So I'm just gonna get the content out there and we'll see what happens. Like, I'll just improve as I go. I also wanted to do a big launch and get a lot of eyes on it, but I was busy doing so many other things also for the rebrand of the business that I was like, I just do not have time or headspace for this, for a podcast launch as well. So I was like, okay, here it is. I'll do a launch next season. So yeah, I just went with it. I was like, okay, here's the content. Good luck with it. And I'll do a launch later.
Oh my gosh, this is so great. So, I mean, I want to do a recap of all the things that you just shared, because I think that you just gave it's like you gave permission in there. You gave like just your story, the struggles that you've had, but they're all normal. And that is podfade. You were struggling with perfectionism to get started, and just having that like ability to keep going, like, just like, I just gotta go. I have to do, if I don't press publish, it's never going to happen. And I think that so many of our listeners, like, they find themselves like, it's normal. Y'all, we're telling y'all all this has happened to me. Like everything that Anne just described, it's happened to me. I know it's happened to most creators and content creators, podcasters that I talk to. These things happen. So I hope that you understand this is a safe space. Like Anne and I are here, not as the people saying that we've been perfect since day one. We're like, hey, actually we've messed up a lot. And here's how you can avoid those mistakes.
Exactly. We can learn from each other's mistakes. That's also why I think it's so important to share it.
Yes. Oh. Well, I really wanted to get into what we were going to talk about today, and that's making money with a podcast, because it's just the number one question. Like after, how do you start a podcast? It's, okay, I started, how do I make money? And I know that this is something that you get really excited about. And we were talking, before we hit record, that we don't want people to leave this conversation today thinking that they have to have thousands of listeners and millions of downloads. So tell me a little bit about your philosophy when it comes to monetizing a podcast.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's super important to monetize a podcast because it makes it possible to keep doing it for a long time and put energy and time into it. If you don't monetize your podcast, it is a hobby, and there's nothing wrong with it. But at some point, maybe you get busy and then you have to choose between something that makes you money and something that does not. And then guess what's going to go? So the reason why I'm so excited about monetizing podcasts is because it makes it possible for people to keep doing it and keep getting your voice out there, sharing your message. And that is what I think is super, super important. And the number one thing that I hear is, like you said, I need to grow my audience more before I monetize, or I need to grow it to 1,000 downloads per episode, or 10,000, or 1,000,000, or I don't know. And that is exactly the problem, because there is always the next milestone. You're never there. Like, you're never gonna reach the goal of the perfect situation where you can monetize your podcast, or like you feel like you can monetize your podcast. So my philosophy is actually monetize your podcast before focusing on growing your audience. And I think that in podcasting and starting a podcast and monetizing, I think there's actually 3 steps. First of all, you start a podcast and you make sure you can stay consistent. Doesn't mean that it has to be every week, but you can also be consistent and work in seasons, which is what I do with the Podcast Babes podcast. That is also consistency, but just make sure that you feel comfortable in creating the content. So also for bloggers and for YouTubers, I think it's the same. Make sure that you know what you need to do to create this content, be comfortable in doing that, and make sure that you can keep doing that. Then the next step, I think, is monetizing. Figure out how you want to make money of this thing. And then grow your audience, because there's already money coming in. So that means your idea is validated. That means that once you grow your audience, there's just more money going to come in. So you can really scale it that way. But you can always wait forever until you've grown your audience. Like, there's no end to that.
Being a woman in business comes with its own unique set of challenges, but also so many opportunities. We get ahead by leaning in to what makes us different from business as usual. I'm Samantha Hartley, host of Profitable Joyful Consulting, inviting you to a special 6-episode series exploring the experience of being a woman in business. You want to hear from women consultants who've hit $1 million, who sell 6-figure engagements, or who've broken their own revenue ceilings? Yeah, those are my clients, and they'll be sharing too. Join me for 6 must-listen episodes that tackle key challenges for women consultants.
Follow Profitable Joyful Consulting on your favorite podcast app.
Yeah. Oh, this is so, so good. And I'm already thinking about all the different ways that we've talked about here on this show about monetizing a podcast. We've talked about affiliate marketing in the past. We've talked about, creating your own products, books, events, programs, just so many different ways that you can monetize. But what is your favorite way that you always tell people either it's the easiest to get started or it has the biggest return on investment?
100% creating your own products or services. That is just the most profitable way to monetize a podcast with a small audience. Because even if you get one client, whatever you might do, if you get one client, like it's all yours. It's almost all profit. And when you have affiliate marketing, you always get a percentage. If you have a sponsor, well, for a smaller audience, or maybe an audience that not necessarily niche down, you cannot ask for that much. So to get started, creating your own products or services is, I don't know if it's the easiest way to get started, but definitely the most profitable. 100% the most profitable. So I think that is always something to consider. I'm not saying that it's always the best way to go. For my podcast, I always call this my other podcast, Digital Nomad Stories, I did not want to do anything of that. I did not want to become a digital nomad coach. I did not want to create a course. Like all the things that I do for the podcast babes, I didn't want to do that again and then for a different topic. It just wasn't exciting to me. So I actually monetized that podcast by getting sponsors on my show, which just feels really good because I can just create the content I want to create and people pay me. So it kind of feels like free money. So I think that's also definitely something to consider. Just saying that consider both strategies. Like first, maybe think about, do I want to create my own products or services? If not, then look at the other monetization methods.
Okay, yeah, this is really good. And I love that you're giving us lots of options because it's what I like. I love to kind of see everything out on the table. Like, okay, what are the different paths that I could take? And what really gets me excited, because like you just said, you have different approaches. And I love, Anne, by the way, that we both have multiple podcasts because it shows that we're truly podcast junkies.
Yes, obsessed.
Because
100%
we're just
obsessed.
We can't have enough. We can't have enough. But I love that you have different approaches to your content depending on like who the audience is, because I'm assuming your audiences are totally different for each podcast and you have to really apply, well, this podcast audience would approach sponsorships, like they'd be okay to it. But if all of a sudden I started pitching this, like they're not ready for this type of program, or like you said, you know yourself well enough that you didn't want to create those types of services or programs for that audience. So I think that it's really important to understand what you enjoy. I mean, at the end of the day, like, is that really what it comes down to when you make those decisions for your podcast?
Yeah, I think question number one, what do you want to do? Like, how do you want to monetize this podcast? If it's not exciting to you, then definitely don't do it because people will hear it and they will not buy. And I think second question, like you said, what does your audience want? Because if you want to sell a specific service, but it's not aligned with your audience, like if they're like not looking for that, then yeah, it's not gonna work. So question number one, what do you want to do? And then question number two, what is your audience looking for? Like know your ideal listener or ideal reader or ideal YouTube person, like viewer, watcher. Know them really, really well. It's like an ideal client, even if they're not a client yet.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. This is so good. Like you're speaking our language here. Like these are things that I love to cover. And I love to hear that we're very similar in how we approach just our thought processes for marketing your content, understanding your audience, and monetizing too, because I think it's super important. One of the things that I really wanted to ask you, because we do have different approaches and maybe our audiences overlap, for your Podcast Babes show and what we do here on the Profit Podcast. But I want to know, like, what are the biggest challenges that you're seeing today for podcasters that are really struggling either to get started or to stay consistent with their show? Like, do you see something that's really just been a trend that's been happening in the last maybe few months, the last year?
I think the two are actually really very, very related. A lot of people start a podcast, but it's very difficult to keep doing it. I think like before the pandemic, we had like 1.5 million podcasts or something, I'm sure you know, or maybe like 2 million. And now I think we're approaching 3 million podcasts. So there is a lot of new podcasts, but there's also so many podcasts that are not releasing new episodes and they just podfade. They just, forgot about the podcast. They don't want to do it anymore. And I think that's really a shame because when I look at my own experience with releasing content consistently every week for Digital Nomad Stories, I approach this as an experiment. I was like, okay, this is my hobby, but I also want to be I was actually curious what would happen if I would release content consistently for a year. So I was like, this is just something I'm doing for myself. I want to, one, really enjoy the journey of creating this podcast. This is my hobby, and I'll keep telling myself that I love this and that this is my hobby. And then second of all, what would happen? Like, what would happen if I do this for a year consistently? I actually also recorded an episode about this for the Podcast Babe, so I share all of this. So I try to keep it short here because it's a whole episode. But what happened basically is that at first, not much happened. It was a slow start. And then all of a sudden, there were more people listening and more people listening. And then at one point, you get that compounding effect of new people who also tell their friends and share about it. And it's in no way has my podcast really like taken off, quote unquote. I still have a relatively small audience. I just want to be very honest and clear about this. It is a small audience compared to some other podcasters. But the cool thing is that it kept growing and growing and growing. And that is only by releasing content consistently. I have not focused on marketing the podcast. I have been focusing on creating the content. Now I'm at a point that I'm like, this is actually pretty cool. I've had 2 sponsors on the podcast so far who reached out to me that I was like, there is something here. There is something working. So now I think like 2 months ago, I started focusing a little bit more on marketing. I created a website for my podcast. Didn't even have that. I just had my Buzzsprout website. And now I'm really a little bit more serious about it because I saw that something was working. But at first, I was just trying to stay consistent. And if you're struggling with this, my number one tip is what I already said. Try to enjoy the journey. Like, make creating the content itself fun. That was a game changer for me. And sometimes it was my episodes go out on Mondays and it was Sunday evening and I was editing my episode and it was not necessarily that much fun. But I still kept telling myself, this is what I do for me. This is what I do to have these conversations with these awesome people, to get my message out in the world. And I started enjoying that so much that it was not a problem to keep going. And yeah, sometimes I had to push myself a little bit to make my deadline to release the episode in time. But then also sometimes just looking back at the content that I created, I was like, oh yeah, that was a good talk. That was a good talk. So really enjoying the content creation process, I think, is the best tip I can give.
Oh, you're speaking my love language here. Like this is what's so fun because, I totally agree with everything you're saying about really just seeing the pieces of the puzzle that you really enjoy and like running towards that instead of looking at all the things that you could possibly be doing. Because I know a lot of my listeners will look at someone like Amy Porterfield or someone that's been, podcasting for a really long time and they have an entire team of people behind them that do all these amazing things. And they're like, well, if I can't even do that much, then why should I even try? And I'm like, no, like you're missing the point. You should do if you enjoy talking to people, like I love doing interviews. And if I were just really struggling to do solo only episodes, but I'm like, I wish I could do more interviews. Like, just switch it up, y'all. It's literally like, let us give you the permission to switch things up to make them more fun, because that is what will help you be more consistent and reach that point of enjoying more of the process. But I do want to go back to what you were saying about, you didn't even have a website whenever you first launched your podcast. What was like that moment of saying, okay, I have this down, like now I should actually start my podcast? Was it once you hit a certain number of episodes, or did you just have more confidence in what you were doing? Like, tell us about that a little bit.
Well, it was actually after I got my sponsorships. So I had a first sponsor reach out, which was about maybe 6 months ago. Then a few months later, probably 3 months ago, another sponsor reached out, and like one or two more reached out and it didn't work out. I also want to be clear about that. There were also negotiations or conversations about sponsorships that didn't work out, but two did. And that was without any marketing, with my Buzzsprout website. And I was like, interesting. Can you imagine what would happen if I have a real website? Well, actually, it was not necessarily about the website, but it was more about, okay, I want to get a little bit more serious about growing my audience. Because if people are already willing to sponsor the show when I don't have anything and no marketing at all, then I think I can really build this into something that might be more of a win-win even for sponsors. And also for myself, I also want to get my message heard by more people, of course. That's super cool. I wanted to keep that growth going as well. So I realized that for the podcast babes, SEO always worked quite well. So I wanted to do that for my other podcast as well. And you just gotta have a website for that. I don't want to send traffic to my Buzzsprout website. So I just got a domain name. I just used podpage to create a website. Like life hack, when you're a podcast and you don't have a website, take a look at podpage. They're awesome. You can do so much. And it's so easy to use. So like literally in half a day, I set up this website, and it's just mainly so that I can get traffic from Google. And then I also want to start up Pinterest. So that is the reason. I already had sponsors and it was already growing, and I just wanted to keep that momentum going. So I was like, I should probably take just the next step. And then, like I mentioned, I haven't started Pinterest yet. I think that is the next step, like the future next step.
Oh, I love that you talk about it in evolutions, though, of, we're going to tackle this one piece of it first, and then we'll move on to the next, and then we'll move on to the next, because I think that those, like having the foundation laid of just being consistent and showing up regularly, for me, it gives me that confidence that I'm like, okay, like I've got this part down. I can add this one more little piece to my plate without everything falling apart and feeling totally overwhelmed.
Exactly. It's so important. And that's also how you can make it not too overwhelming, because taking the next step will always be a little bit scary, which is fine. But you also, like you mentioned, you don't want to get totally overwhelmed and then just say, oh, never mind, I won't monetize this podcast. Just figure out one next step. And of course, if you have a big goal, like a North Star, you know how they call it, like one big goal that you're working towards, that's always good, because then you know which way to go. But then like the specific steps, I like to just figure those out as I go.
Yeah. Oh, this is so good. And we could just nerd out about all of our podcasting stories, about like all of our experiences, our ups and downs, like the highs and the lows. But I did want to ask you one other question, and then we're going to move into our rapid fire questions, which are always super, super fun. But I want to ask you, what are you most excited about in podcasting? Like looking forward in the future, is there something that you're like, oh, I can't wait until, this one piece of the puzzle gets figured out? Or do you have a fun new tool that you're using or anything like that?
I think it's that. I think it's all the fun new tools that are popping up. I think podcasting is just going to get easier and easier, and that also makes it more fun. I always like it when there's a lot happening in the industry, and that is definitely the case in the podcast industry. There's more podcasts starting, but that also means that there is more tools popping up, like new innovations and softwares and things like that. So just that whole like vibe of new things, like yes. I love that. I think that is super exciting. Another thing, so on the one hand, like all the innovations that are happening, but also more and more sponsors or more corporations, businesses are also willing to sponsor podcasts because they're really starting to see the value. I think it's I feel like it's kind of podcast sponsorships and influencer marketing, like as two separate things, but it's the same, right? It's basically the same, because as a podcaster, you're also an influencer. So I think that there will be even more opportunities in the near future for monetizing podcasts that way, with brand deals, sponsorships, partnerships, things like that.
Yes, I feel like that, I always think about like those big lights, if there's like a big event or something like those huge spotlights. I feel like that they have just shined one on podcasting, and it just continues to get brighter and brighter. And it's so exciting. So I'm glad that we're both, doing what we do, because it's fun and it's an exciting time to be a podcaster, be a creator, and to do all the things that we're doing. So y'all, have more fun. Have more fun on your content. That's what we're telling you to do.
Yes, key takeaway of this episode for sure.
Yes. Well, I wanted to get into our rapid fire questions. So I have 3 questions for you. So are you ready for them?
I don't know. Let's say yes. A little bit scared, but also ready.
They're not too hard, I promise. I promise they're not hard. The first one is, what piece of advice would you give to a brand new podcaster or content creator?
Start now and figure it out as you go.
Oh, that's a great one. The next one's a 2-part question. So what is a dream podcast that you would love to be on? And who is your dream podcast guest you would love to interview?
Ooh, that's really difficult. Well, I think I already had my dream guest on. I'm kind of obsessed with an Australian entrepreneur, a female entrepreneur, Steph Taylor, and she came on my podcast, which it was huge for me. So I don't know. I feel like I already have my highlight. I could probably stop podcasting now.
Awesome.
I don't know. You know what? Like, I really, I think a lot of the big names in the industry are really cool. Especially, I focus on female podcasters, but also like Boss Babe, Amy Porterfield, Jenna Kutcher. I think they're super cool, and I would love to have them on my show, but I'm also not starstruck. Like, that is just not really how I see people. Maybe I'm Dutch, I'm very down to earth, so I think I'm just maybe not impressed enough.
I love your honesty. This is so good. Yes. This is so good. And we're going to link too. We had Steph on the show as well, and she is so fun to chat with. So we're going to link back to her show because she's great. If y'all aren't following her what she does is so fantastic. But the last question that I have for you is, do you consider yourself a perfectionist?
Recovering perfectionist. In law school, they literally teach you to be a perfectionist. So after 5 years of law school, I had to unlearn a lot. I think as a business owner and or content creator, you cannot be a perfectionist. Like, you have to try to get rid of that as soon as possible. But I also think it's a process, right? Like, sometimes I'm a little bit more of a perfectionist than other times. So it kind of comes in phases, but I try not to be.
Oh, you're in good company. We've had a lot of recovering perfectionists on the show. I'm one of them as well. So yes, you're in good company. Well, Anne, this has been so much fun. Can you please tell everybody where we can connect with you and how they can listen to the podcast, babes, and all the things we need to know?
Yeah, so come to my home on the internet. It is thepodcastbabes.com. You can find everything we do. Probably also a link to this episode once it's live will be there. And you can also listen to the Podcast Babes podcast. You can also go to thepodcastbabes.com/podcast. And there you'll find all the episodes, including the one with Krystal that we already recorded and will be out soon.
Yes, thank you so much for being on the show today, Anne.
Thank you so much. This was so fun.
That was so good, wasn't it? I love interacting and engaging with Anne. I loved being on her podcast. So you're going to have to go check out the Podcast Babes. I'm going to have everything that we talked about linked in the show notes. But I said this in the very beginning of today's episode. I love content creation so much because it connects me with other people that I don't know that I would have had another reason for Anne and I's paths to cross, or for us to nerd out about something that we both are just so passionate for. So I am so grateful for podcasting. I'm grateful for wonderful people like Anne, who she gets it. Like, she gets me. She gets my nerdiness about podcasting and content creation and marketing. And it's just so fun whenever I get to meet super passionate people that have a heart to help other people share their message and have a successful platform. But that's all I have for you today. So make sure you go check out the show notes and connect with Anne. I'm going to link to everything in the show notes, which is krystalprofit.com/episode 370. That is what we're on today. I know, I cannot believe it myself. But if this is your first time tuning in, I'm so grateful that you got to hear Anne's conversation today. It was such a treat. But make sure you hit that subscribe or follow button wherever you're listening to this podcast. And as always, remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere. Hey, Profit Podcast listeners. Thanks for sticking around to a little bit after the episode to hear this special message, because I want to hear from you. We are starting a new segment called Fan Mail Shoutouts, and I want to hear from you, and I want to hear your questions. What do you want to know? What questions have you been dying to ask me? So here's how to make this happen. Go to the app where you're listening to this podcast right now. Go there. I'll wait a second. Okay. Now, once you're there, you're going to see a hyperlink at the top of the episode description that says, send Krystal a text message. And that's all I want you to do. Send me a text. It could be casual, informal. It could be totally anonymous. Or if you want, you can include your name and the name of your podcast or content wherever you are creating, and I will give you a special shout out in an upcoming episode. So again, go to the show notes for where you're listening to this episode right now, and it will say, send Krystal a text message. And I cannot wait to hear from you and give you a shout out in an upcoming segment of Fan Mail Shoutouts.